Today's video lesson is going to discuss a couple of literary terms that we need to be familiar with, characterization and foreshadowing, and it's also going to give a preview of the next short story that we'll read called The Most Dangerous Game. So let's go ahead and start with characterization. Now we're all familiar with characters in a story, and we've talked a little bit about protagonist and antagonist, and we've talked about static and dynamic types of characters. So we're familiar with the types of characters, the people that are in the story, but characterization has to do with how the author reveals a character's personality to us. And there's two ways that an author does that. It's through either direct characterization or indirect characterization. So let's start with direct characterization. I'm going to give you an example of direct characterization. The definition here is when an author directly describes a character's personality through physical description or stating the character's thoughts. This is the obvious description of the character where the author directly tells us he was this tall, he looked like this, he liked pizza, he was really fast. You know, the author tells us directly, very clearly, what this character is like. And so the example I have here is actually from our short story, The Most Dangerous Game. He was a tall man, past middle age, for his hair was a vivid white, but his thick eyebrows and pointed military mustache were as black as the night. And so here, this is an example of direct characterization because we see that he's tall. We know that he's an older man. He has white hair, thick eyebrows, and he has a mustache that's dark black. And so without looking at this picture that I've given to you here, you could have created a mental image in your head of what this character probably looked like. And so this is the author directly describing the character. You don't have to think about it too much. It's the direct statement of what the character is like. So the opposite of that is indirect characterization, where we have to kind of guess a little bit about what the character, their personality is like. The definition here, when an author uses actions or other events to let the reader learn about a character's personality. Normally this is going to be your traits such as bravery, cowardice, pride, things that we can't see physically. We just have to learn about the character through their own actions or through events that happen in the story. I use the word here inferred. You are inferring. You're having to read between the lines and make your own assumptions about the character based on what they do in the story. So here's another example that is also from our story, The Most Dangerous Game. Rainsford, that's one of the characters in our story, had dug himself in France when a second's delay meant death. That had been a placid pastime compared to his digging now. So this talks about him digging, and it talks about him digging in at France. Well, you have to have some background information, which we'll talk about later on in this video lesson, but that talks about a soldier fighting in World War I had to dig in at France to fight in the trenches of World War I. And so here it's implied to us, it's inferred to us that this character Rainsford had to have been a soldier. And so he would be, since he's a soldier, we can assume that he was skilled in combat, and so he knows how to survive. And so we kind of get all that without the author directly telling us, and that's why it's indirect characterization. All right, our other literary term that we want to discuss is foreshadowing, and I know many of you are familiar with foreshadowing. We talked about it a little bit before in our last short story that we read, The Cask of Amontillado. But I want to give you an exact definition of foreshadowing. It's the use of words or phrases that give hints to the reader of something that is going to happen without revealing the story or spoiling the suspense. And so we talked about it in our last short story, how it was mentioned that Fortunato says, "I shall not die of a cough." And that was actually foreshadowing because later on in the story, he does actually die of a cough. And so that is a great example of that, where the author was going to give us those little bitty hints to let us know something is happening, something is coming up, without totally spoiling it for us. And so a great example here is from the movie The Lion King.
We're pals, right?
Right.
And we'll always be together, right?
Simba, let me tell you something that my father told me. Look at the stars. The great kings of the past look down on us from those stars.
Really?
Yes. So whenever you feel alone, just remember that those kings will always be there to guide you. And so am I. Simba, you have forgotten me.
No. How could I?
You have forgotten who you are, so forgotten me. Look inside yourself, Simba. You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in the circle.
All right, so this is a great example of foreshadowing, because here, when Simba is young, his dad is telling him to look up to the stars because the great kings of the past will be able to guide you. And so when Simba gets older, his dad does look down on him from the stars. And so it was foreshadowing his own death, that Mufasa knew that eventually he would die and that he would go up to the stars. And I don't think Simba realized at the time, and we probably didn't think about it very much either as an audience, until Mufasa does die and Simba grows up, and Simba's got to find his way, so he looks to the stars for guidance. So we're going to look for examples of characterization and foreshadowing in our short story, The Most Dangerous Game. But let's go ahead and talk about some things that I think that are important for you to know before you actually start reading The Most Dangerous Game. First, let's start with the title. This is a short story that was written by Richard Connell, and in our title, the word game actually has two meanings. The first is the game that we think of, like a basketball game or a board game. It's a contest where we have a winner and a loser. And then the second meaning of game is an animal that is being hunted. Those of you that may hunt, you refer to whatever it is that you're hunting as your game. And so this story is going to deal with the idea of big game hunting. And big game hunting was something that was very popular in the 1920s especially, but even before then. And actually people still hunt today with big game hunting, but it involved hunting large animals that were seen as dangerous. And so it was a thrill-seeking hobby. People wanted to hunt these animals because there was an element of danger to it, and it was something that wealthy people did because they were able to travel, see the world, hunt these animals, and it was something that they could brag about to their other wealthy friends. And so a negative effect of big game hunting is that it did contribute to the decline of certain animal populations. Rhinoceroses, elephants, giraffes, and especially lions, tigers. Those animal populations still have not really recovered from some of the big game hunting that used to take place. And so it is still legal in some areas, but has mostly been outlawed in many areas of the world, especially for certain animals. Another topic that we need to talk about is the Russian Revolution. You can already tell that this story takes place about 100 years ago. It's going to take place in the 1920s. And so we've already discussed a little bit about World War I. But another event that was very important to this time period was the Russian Revolution. And so basically in 1917, the lower class, working class Russian citizens decided they needed to overthrow their ruler, who was Tsar Nicholas II. Tsar is the same thing as a king in Russia. And when they overthrew him, they created a communist government. And I know many of you probably heard the word communist before, and it gets a very negative connotation, mostly because of the communist regimes here in Russia. And basically, a communist-style government is a government where everybody is supposedly treated as equal. There is nobody owns any property. Everybody has the same things. Everybody is supposed to be equal. And so, in this type of society, there's no wealth. There's no personal wealth. So rich people can't really exist in this type of society. And so what happened with the Russian Revolution is the people who did have wealth in Russia had to flee the country, or else they were going to be killed, because the working class had decided that they were tired of being abused and mistreated by the rich. And so that has something to do with our story. I think it'll make more sense once you read our story. But the main thing I want you to be familiar with is that many wealthy Russian aristocrats — aristocrat is an interesting word that means somebody with money and political influence, the elite of society — they had to flee Russia because of the Russian Revolution. So a lot of people who were from Russia were never allowed to return to Russia. Last thing we need to talk about is World War I. We mentioned it briefly earlier. This was a war fought between 1914 and 1918. France, Britain, the United States, as well as some other countries, fought against Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and some other smaller countries as well. And this was, one of the first — this is probably the first real modern war with modern style weapons, and so it did lead to a lot of deaths because people were not used to fighting with such advanced weaponry. But one of the main methods of fighting was known as trench warfare, where basically they dug these huge holes, these huge ditches, and the soldiers sat in the ditches, set up barbed wire fence, and they'd pop their head up and shoot at the other side, and they'd shoot cannons at the other side. And it was really a gruesome, terrible way to hold a fight, because it would move very slowly. It would take a long time for somebody to win a battle. And so digging in at the trenches was something that was very important, being able to dig quickly and be able to move quickly. And so that also has something to do with our story as well.